So this is our second iteration, and we plan on doing this on a monthly basis. With that, today's webinar is scheduled to run about 30 to 45 minutes, depending on Alan. And following that, we will do a 10 to 15-minute Q&A session in which we will take a look at all the questions that you've had throughout today's presentation. If you look at the bottom of your screen in the middle, there's a Q&A function. Please ask all questions through this function. Alan will be sharing a PowerPoint, which you're seeing right now, and I will collect any questions that you submit as we go along. And then in the end, I will curate and help facilitate a Q&A session. And then with that, I think that's pretty much it. So on that note, allow me to introduce Alan Foster. And Alan, take it away.
Thank you very much, Eric, and thank you for those nice words. This topic of intelligent authentication is one that I'm actually quite excited about. And so as we sort of go through it, I want to challenge some of the assumptions that many of us have when we start looking at authentication. And then have a look at some of the stuff that we're doing in ForgeRock. But the reality about it is that the example is what's coming out of ForgeRock. It doesn't change the underlying authentication pieces that we're talking about, pretty much no matter what we're doing for identity. Okay, we've got to have the ubiquitous market trend slide, right? So no matter where we go for market trends, no matter what we look at in the market, the one thing that is clearly obvious is that authentication is somehow broken. Not broken from the perspective that, well, I get to a page and I can't log in, but broken from the perspective that authentication is not something that me, as a user, it's not something that I look forward to interacting with. Authentication is something that fundamentally gets in the way between me and what I'm trying to get to. And so the very best that we can hope for is that the end user begrudgingly interacts with us in whatever that authentication method is, so that they can get to actually what they really want. The other side of that problem is that our users are scared beyond belief that somebody's going to go online and pretend to be them. And so, you know, hardly a day goes by that we don't see a news reference or something on CNN or over the news about the latest cyber threats, the latest breach, the latest data breach, and all of our personal data being leaked out or accessed by so-called bad people. And a lot of that is the fact that we use passwords like password or admin123 and things like that, and that we have to remember dozens and dozens of different passwords in order to get into the resource we actually need. From an enterprise perspective, these are the businesses that many of us work for. We need to know more about our customer. But I'm going to come back to the slide. I want to stop at this point, and I want to talk about this page. This is what we think of as authentication. It's the login page, that horrible page that shows up between where we are and the really interesting information that we want to get to. And most of us think of authentication as an action. I want to challenge this, and I want to say that authentication is not just an action, right? Authentication has different meanings. It represents different things to different people, or at least to different stakeholders during the authentication process. What do I mean by stakeholders? Well, there's security, there's the business, there's the product owner who's trying to get the end user to buy something. And let's not forget, there's that ultimate end user. Each and every one of them have different goals, different expectations, and the different goals and expectations that they have out of the authentication process. So what do I mean by that? The authentication process and trying to identify who that user is and the relationship that we have with that user and how we build up that relationship is actually something that extends well over time. There are multiple facets to what this sort of matrix looks like, right, across a whole range of different kinds of matrices. What do I mean by that? Well, the way that we authenticate changes over time. What we start off when we have a very early process in the relationship, we probably have to go through some more complex process in terms of trying to work out who the user is or identifying them. Later on in the process, once we become comfortable with them and we know who they are, that ends up changing. I'll dive into each one of these in the next few minutes. But the stakeholders are another one, right? I mentioned all of these different stakeholders and different people that are involved in it. And then the third one is the level of assurance, right? And how badly we need to know exactly who that user is. Starting off sort of over time, right? If you're going to a website and you are just looking to have them send you a newsletter, I really don't want to give that website my username and my password and my address and my all of the personal information as to sort of what's going on. All I want is their email. And, you know, send me the email. Conversely, if I'm going through a process of selling my house, I'm kind of really expecting that they are going to have to check who I am and what I am so that I can, so that somebody doesn't sell my house out from underneath me. The underlying authentication processes with that are different, right? There's a different level of assurance that we need to come out of that picture. Likewise, in terms of the things that we're pulled in, right? The different goals, the different expectations that people within the process have, often we find ourselves as authentication engineers pulled in a dozen different directions. They each want to get something different out of it. The CISO and the security side of it is very different than the business owner. And of course, the level of the assurance, right? What we're actually willing to accept for the identity. Whether it's my passport or simply a conference badge is going to be quite sort of very different depending on the use case. So really what I'm sort of saying here is that authentication, this page that we end up coming up with, is really all about context and keeping track with who the user is and what they end up needing to know, right? What we're going to do with that information. So the authentication action, this single page, is not an action at all, right? Authentication is not an action, but the result of a complex process. A complex process that's going to have the several different needs for several different people, right? The different stakeholders have different needs and different results. And what I mean by this is that the business owner is simply trying to get product sold. The security staff is trying to make sure that the right person is able to log in. The administrative people want to be able to know how many users are logging in over what period of time. And so that action is not just a single black box action. We want to make that a white box process. Rather than just clicking our finger on it and determining who the user is, what we really want to do is see inside that process, right? We want to be able to see what is happening, how long it's taking, and where it's ending up going. This is what we're trying to achieve with the intelligent authentication. Which brings me back to those market trends, right? Customer experience, the piece that we're trying to deal with in terms of what the end user is trying to get to, what the cyber threats are, what the issues are around the weak passwords, and likewise, being able to know what's happening with those end users. So how are we actually doing that? Right? What are we actually doing to try and make that there, right? The end user experience. We just said the end user is really important because they are the ones who's actually trying to do that. And we want to be able to give them an experience where they have control over the choice and they get sort of the intrusion is much less in their experience, right? We don't want to put ourselves in the middle of their experience and break up what they are trying to get to. So they need to have control, they need to have choice. But at exactly the same time, we want to be able to get the security better. We want to ensure that all of the signals that are there are able to be interpreted properly by the security side of things. Simpler and faster. Simple is always great. And so when we start building these things, we want to be able to make it simpler and faster in order to happen. But sort of next piece that comes up to this is we've seen all over the different conferences that we have, Identiverse, IdentityNORTH, IEC in Europe, everybody is talking about, let's get rid of the password, let's get away from the password. There are many, many signals as we build the relationship between the user and the vendor or the customer, whoever it is they're working with. As that relationship becomes richer, there are many, many other signals that we have in order to do that authentication. If we can see what's going on inside of it, right? Getting that visibility into the underlying process, right? And it's really all part of the authentication context itself. And so those are sort of the key words that we end up having with it. I have a bunch of people running around outside of the room here, hopefully not trying to get through with it. Anyway, so the benefits that we're trying to end up dealing with, right? We want to give more information to the service providers, give more visibility into it, is so they can actually see what's happening, see who the end user is, and give them dynamic personalization to actually get into their experience. And all of that is basically relationship based, right? With the intrusion, less intrusive, and being able to trying to do a less intrusive process and getting into their actual journey. So that's really what we're trying to do. We are trying to provide insight and control over the authentication process. We're trying to give as much flexibility into that authentication so that we can control the process and give the outcomes into the actual users, right? The different stakeholders, and give them the information that they need. So some examples, right? Let me try and show you specifically in terms of what we're trying to do. Here's an example. So what we've done here, this is an authentication process where when you set up the authentication, instead of looking at it just by looking at one big authentication step, we've broken it down into each one of the different components of that step. And then as part of those components, some of them may be specifically focused on the authentication step. Some of them may be focused on to collecting other kinds of information. And some of them may be focused on metrics and things like that, right? So each one of these, you can build up what the actual user flow is going to end up looking like. These components are also pluggable. So you can write your own. You can drop your own components and have visibility into it. So in a normal authentication process where we would look at it and say, collect the username, collect the password, check to see if they're in our data store, and if they're not, and they've retried too many times to lock it out, that's what this process would end up doing. But we haven't dictated how that works. What we've actually said is, let's build this up as an actual flow. Let me look at another one. Right here, we've got one that's diving into quite a lot more detail. we're actually bringing in a plugin that allows for the user themselves to actually choose what's going on. So the user itself is getting the actual choice, right, that we're putting into it. And as part of the authentication process, we're giving the user the actual choice to get their own data inside of the actual authentication process. We're bringing up the user interface that they can choose one way or another. And then based on their choice, right, we're saying, okay, let's use a persistent cookie. It's something that we're using over the long term. Or potentially, let's use their username and password. Right? And in either case, we're going to go back to the data store to get the decision. Now, why is this different than normal things that we end up seeing with authentication? Most authenticators that you end up buying or that you use in different software, you can absolutely do this flow. The difference is that it's not defined by the authenticator, it's defined by you. You have actually put this together. You've defined what the user choice is, and you've defined as to exactly what the outcomes are for that. The end user might be able to.
Alan, you're getting a little cut off. I don't know if you're losing connection due to location physically.
Okay, well, I'll tell you what, give me 2 seconds then, and I'll try and move my way around and get a better connection out of here.
Perfect.
Hopefully it's not going to, hopefully it's not. So let's see if we got over here. There we are. How about that? Is that giving me any better signal in here?
Better signal, yes. A little bit better,
okay.
But I think we'll take echo over poor signal.
Echo over signal. So here we've got an example where we've got end user loops, right? We're trying to control what's happening during the process. And so we said, well, if the user doesn't get their password right, we're going to loop back, try it again. And obviously, if they only go, I don't know, 3 times, 5 times, whatever it might be, and they still can't get their password, well, then we'll give up all hope on them and fail. Again, this is not unusual, right? Many authenticators will do this. But you've got control over what's happening. You can also see there on the sort of that highlighted in the red piece, right? This is an example of where you can build up specific, let's call them, I don't know, subroutines. Subroutines of components that you want to be able to have into the authentication process and walk through that. And you can then call them from your authentication. So far, I haven't really shown anything significant out of it, right? Other than the fine-grained control that you actually have over the authentication process itself. But let's go and have a look at some interesting things here, because now I can actually do things in the authentication steps that are not actually authentication. I don't know about you guys, but when I go to a website and I click on the link to go and get some data, and I get a registration page. And now I've got to go through dozens and dozens of pages in order to get my registration. I just close the window and I say, well, I didn't really want to know anyway, and so I leave. With progressive profiling as part of your authentication, you can start building up a relationship, right? You start building up you build up a relationship with the end user and start collecting pieces of information slowly, over time, as you start building more and more of a relationship with that user. So first of all, we might just get a username and password. Later on, maybe we want to collect an email address. After that, maybe we want to associate a phone number with this. The key point is that the decisions about when you do that are not sort of heavyweight decisions. They can be done as part of the actual authentication steps. And you can see here, we're actually going out and going to the user's profile and saying, do we have this information from them? If we haven't, let's prompt them to actually give us that information. Lots of interesting sort of marketing related services. One of the things that people say is that users will be willing to give us a little bit of information at an appropriate time in exchange for a reasonable service. And later on, as they become more comfortable with us, they will give more information. And as you build that relationship, that information is then sort of built from a more trusted mechanism. Let's not forget our security folks, right? So here's an example where we've got a node in there that's not doing any authentication whatsoever. What that authentication is doing is it's simply validating against IP address. Now, how you get that IP address, and there's a whole conversation we can go down about address spoofing and things like that. But, you know, if this is Alan and he's using the same browser that he normally uses, and he's coming from the same IP address that he normally uses, for most purposes, I'm probably willing to accept that that's Alan. If he does a very risky transaction or he does something that Alan doesn't normally do, well, then maybe I want to do something additional later on. But at the moment, I'm willing to accept it's Alan. On sort of, when you think about it, that sounds somewhat risky. But every single one of us that have used Amazon have seen this in process. When you go to Amazon, you don't see a login page. You don't see a registration page. What you see is stuff to buy. And then once you choose something to buy, if you've bought something recently, it doesn't even go in and prompt you for anything. It simply says, great, do you want this shipped to home? And goes ahead and sells you the product. This is looking at the relationship that they have with you and being able to make these fine-grained decisions. Here's a big, horrible diagram, but it shows you the kinds of things we can get into, right? Those pluggable components can collect information from the underlying requests and responses. And I'm showing here on the right-hand side, down the bottom right-hand corner, the kinds of things that we can actually capture from maybe which operating system you're running, which browser you're running. Really, why do we care? Well, the reason that we care is that the person who's responsible for managing our web applications needs to be able to answer the question, how much money am I going to put into supporting the Macintosh as a browser, as an OS, or supporting Opera as a browser, right? If he can see that 30% of his Mac traffic is coming in using Opera as a browser, that makes it much easier for that person to be able to say, hey, I need to put money onto development of features for these particular browsers. If no one is coming in from, I don't know, maybe it's my Ericsson smartphone and nobody is ever accessing our website for that, well, now we can start making decisions about where to access resources and things like that. We can also pass this information back through to back-end services, right? So we can say, yeah, this user has logged in from a mobile device, or this user has logged in from a Linux system or something like that. And later on in our back-end systems, we can provide specific information that is applicable to the device that they're using or the OS that they're using or whatever it is that they may be using. Whether it is for security reasons or usability reasons or whatever those might be, right? So using this device context, right, we can actually pass the individual information to the back end. The reason I've got this in here is have a look at the little boxes. So we start, the first thing we do is we say, is this an IP address that we're willing to accept? Yes. Then it goes to geo-analysis. And maybe we want to keep track of how many users are logging into our site or how many users are authenticating coming from Europe. Well, that little box that says EMEA counter, all that is doing is just keeping track of the number of times we branch down that flow. It's not actually doing anything of the authentication itself, but it's keeping track of a counter for us. Likewise, after looking at the operating system, we have another counter that's keeping track of mobile devices. Now, is that important to you? Maybe, maybe not. But giving that visibility into what is happening during the authentication process is really, really valuable to the people who have to make decisions and actually look at how the system itself is actually performing and what resources need to be put into the entire system in order to support those. What about bots? You know, how does somebody's got to be able to track how many bots are attacking our site, which accesses are bots, what about usernames that may be compromised and things like that. So here's another example of where we're going to use an external service, right, Open Threat Intelligence, that we can call out to that service and say, hey, is there anything particularly bad about this? If there is, we can just fail the authentication straight off, right? Yep, that's a known bad site, just don't even go there. Again, the key point that I'm talking about here is that what we are looking at is actually the internal operation of the authentication. What we used to think of as the authentication step, right? That login page that we were looking at. And now you've got control over these decisions. You can make different decisions and you can store information around them and make logical business decisions about those. And then some really interesting stuff, right? Notice the very first box we have on here is we've got a timer. Why a timer? Well, very often you will see requirements from various application developers or user experience side of the house that end up saying, oh, well, authentication cannot take any more than 2 seconds. Well, how do we verify that? I mean, we could have somebody sitting logging into the website all day, every day, making sure that it doesn't take more than 2 seconds. But here we've got a timer start over on the left-hand side of the window. And right on the right-hand side, we've got a timer stop. That's taking a time over how long it takes us to move through this process. Now here we've only got one. Obviously, you can have any number of ones inside of that and you can start dealing with it. But what we're doing, and sort of the idea that I'm trying to get to, is we've opened up the authentication process into a set of maybe we could call them micro steps or the individual components of the different things that happen during authentication. And what that enables us to do is have different components meeting the requirements for all of those different stakeholders that we had up front. You remember the 25 different arrows pulling us all over the place? Each one of those requirements can be satisfied by a different component that we drop into our entire process, which means basically the business development can see what kind of browsers are using the site. The security side can see exactly what threats are there and whether we're, bots and invalid access. The business development can actually have a look at it and say, yep, we're managing to do this in whatever it is, under 2 seconds or under 1 second. Likewise, if we're calling off to a third-party service, we can validate that they are meeting their service level agreements, right? We can have a timer before we call them and a timer after we call them. And we can say, yep, all of our calls to XYZ analytical service are happening in under 500 milliseconds or whatever the agreement is on that. So it gives us much more control over being able to manage the relationship, because we can actually, during the authentication process, find out things about the user, right? As we did a couple of slides back where we were looking at the IP address and things like that. That means that we can start building the relationship. We know this user, and we can start doing authentication steps that maybe doesn't have to have them type in a username and password. Oh, that's Alan's phone. Alan's phone, yes, I validated that, so we'll just log Alan in. And that gives a much richer experience to the end user. And doing all of that, we've implemented it with this nice drag and drop sort of design model. It doesn't have to be that. It can be any way you like. The key point that we've done is we're trying to get into the actual process. So you can drag and drop the components and connect them all together. Well, we think of a bunch of different components, or what we call nodes, that we ship with the product. There's a bunch of them here, right? And there's a few other ones. There's a bunch of different nodes. But what about if you want to be able to do something yourself? And the reality is that's where most of the value comes in, because those nodes are pluggable. They're APIs that any implementer or any customer can write their own. All of these we didn't write. They're available up on our marketplace, but these have been written by customers or other implementers in order to solve specific problems, whether they are knowledge base or capture or black and white IP addresses, so you can manage which ones are good and which ones are bad. Running a script on the client side, all of these are ones that are up there. From any number of different partners, and this is, from our perspective, really, really important. The reason it's important is that there's no way that one company is going to be able to keep up with all of the different authentication technologies that are changing every 3 months, right? Every time you wake up in the morning, there's a new biometric or a new kind of authentication method. The reality is that they're all good. And so they can simply work as nodes or as plugins into that entire process. So we have all sorts of partner integrations that have done connections into their technology, thereby enabling you to have more control over when it is called, how it is called, and how it's enforced for the ultimate end user. And up on our website, this is the arbitrary plug, right? Up on our website on backstage.fordrock.com, there's a marketplace up there, which is where all of our partners, as well as many of the community vendors and the community developers, are able to submit their own. As you can see, some of these here have been submitted from the community, unsupported, but they're up there. They full source code to all of those so that you can add additional ones into it. So I'm going to stop at that point. I see I've been speaking now for just under nearly 40 minutes, 35 minutes. And I'm going to stop at that point and say, Eric, I think I saw some questions coming in there.
Oh, thanks, Alan. Yes. Well, that was wonderful. We did, I think we had a slight glitch with regards to the technical in terms of questions. So I think we got one question has come in. If anyone else within the attendee audience does have questions, please do go ahead and put your questions in now. And then we can use this as an opportunity to essentially have a free-form conversation with Alan. But the one question we have so far appears to be, in your estimation, how many people are currently using passwordless authentication versus traditional password authentication?
That's an interesting philosophical question, and one that actually can have quite a lot of interesting discussion around it. So there is a lot of effort across the industry to move away from passwords. However, it seems that it is to move away from passwords in many situations. So maybe not moving away from them completely, but as an example, you know, I'm going to go back to Amazon. and say, if you look at Amazon, yes, Amazon uses username and password in order to log in. However, once you have established a relationship with Amazon, they really authenticate you in other ways, right? They look at cookies in your browser, and they look at your browsing history, and you can actually go to Amazon on what looks like a whole new session and buy product without actually being prompted for a username and password. In other cases, there are quite a lot of folks who are utilizing, they still have the password, but they've added in some form of multi-factor, things like YubiKey, and some of those kinds of factors. One of the nice things about password that nothing else really replicates is that, I'm not going to say it's easy to remember, but it's an awful lot easier to remember than, a YubiKey or a 60-digit hex string and things like that. So ultimately, as a fallback position, most people are still using sort of passwordless or password, at least as an option. I know when I go into Google, I use a second factor and I use a YubiKey to get into it in that way. So, it is definitely moving down that path.
Excellent. We've got another question here from Nancy Peterson. It's specifically, how many financial institutions are using knowledge-based authentication versus digital verification versus biometrics in Canada?
No idea, or not too much in Canada specifically. I know internationally there's a lot of effort around financial institutions around moving away from the username and password. And they are definitely moving towards sort of different kinds of alternatives. One of the scary things that the financial institutions have to be able to take into account is the fact that they still have to deal with the case of an end user not being able to sign in, right? And a username and password is still sort of one of the ways into that. And knowledge base is another way that you can at least try and establish the user's sort of identity. In fact, I ran into this problem with Bank of America, in that in order for me to prove who I am, they wanted the last 4 digits of my credit card, which conveniently was in a desk drawer at home. And so while I was traveling internationally, I had no way to prove who I was. Biometrics is becoming more and more interesting. However, it still has a fairly high failure rate. Low, I mean, they're getting up into the 80s and 90%. But, the biometrics tends to be a confidence rating rather than a yes or no. And so generally they tend to use biometrics more for verifying who you are rather than trying to do a straight identification. But I've seen ones in the US. I have seen USAA that's using voice print. I think HSBC in the UK was using voice print and face recognition. So more and more we're beginning to see these technologies sort of being used, but financial and healthcare are still very sensitive to, how badly it can go wrong.
Excellent. Next, we have a question said that the title, or at least the description of the webinar, included multi-factor authentication. What types or what multi-factor authentication are you currently seeing in market?
So multi-factor really is, there's sort of 3 different things that we're seeing within that, right? Generally, what you're trying to do is you're trying to authenticate through some other channel. So the easiest that I've seen is obviously institutions who are using things like SMS to send you a one-time password. There's also various standards around one-time passwords. Oath is a standard for doing that, and the Google Authenticator does those one-time passwords. So there's definitely use around that. There's also quite a lot of use around the biometric apps. So people like Duo, Dayon, Face ID, and I'm probably going to miss out a whole bunch of ones that I probably should mention, that have different kinds of authenticators that add in as a second factor. There's also the sort of understanding that the mobile phone is becoming such an important part of our life that it in itself can be used as a second factor, right? Sending a push notification to the phone and authorizing that with either face recognition or fingerprint or even PIN code on the phone shows us a second factor, being the phone and the desktop. And then, of course, there's the hardware implementations like YubiKey, which are, you know, those little pins that you plug into the USB port and pieces like that. So definitely more and more pieces are coming out around putting additional factors rather than the username and password. And our model is absolutely that, right? We don't know what they all are, and we can't even begin to come up with the different models for it. So our model is that anybody can build one of those drop-in nodes to do different kinds of multi-factor, different kinds of devices. It's more and more challenging when we start dealing with the consumer space because we can't tell consumers what to do. We can suggest, we can try, but we can't tell them what to do. But there's definitely sort of as many as you can think of. There are implementations with those and then probably more.
So interesting that you mentioned all of these different types of tools, because I'm seeing a question here from Don Wall, which seems to be a segue into when looking at these various different solutions, if we're looking at, say, like Face ID, Don of Applied Recognition is asking, how does one integrate with ForgeRock, or how does one become a partner with ForgeRock?
Actually, that's probably the easiest one to answer. So all of these that I've been talking about are part of our standard API. And so sort of working with ForgeRock, if you come and join us on backstage.forgerock.com, anybody can join up onto a Backstage account. It just requires an email address and you can sign in. All of our documentation is up there. And there's quite an active developer area with a forum area and things like that. But all of the documentation is up there and you can go and have a look with that. There's also, if you're sort of looking at specifically as an integration, absolutely, you can email me and I can put you in contact with the right folks who generally, and you know, not to make any bones about it, but generally what it ends up being is if there is commercial reason to get together, if there's a joint customer or something like that, it's amazing how quickly those things end up happening and we can connect those together. But as you saw from that page with the community, we actually have quite a number of community members who simply create the plugins or do integrations simply from our public API.
Great. Hopefully that helps Don with his mission.
We've got a question. I was just going to say, Don, feel free if you want to email me directly and I can put you in contact with the right folks.
Fantastic. We've got a question here from Fred Carter that says, should you disclose the details of passive authentication methods to users, or just let them enjoy the basic magic of seamless access in ignorant bliss?
I'm all for seamless access and ignorant bliss, personally. I mean, one of the problems of disclosing the mechanisms behind the sort of seamless logging or the passwordless, when we look at it from that perspective, is the fact that it's giving more information for people who are trying to fool it. And although secrecy is not, you know, obfuscation is not security, but you know, there is something that says, you know, the less you tell about exactly what you're checking on or what you're validating, the more chance you have of someone slipping up and catching their efforts. If it invades if it's something that is invasive on their privacy, I don't think it's a bad thing to actually tell people, we are we're going to store a cookie on your browser in order for us to be able to easily recognize you in the future. Yeah, I think that sort of helps with transparency. But yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I don't know that there's a right answer to that. There's only many different answers depending. That sounds like something that at IdentityNORTH we would probably end up talking about over a beer and find that it lasts for several beers.
All right. I think we've got time for one more question. We've got one here from a Medmo that says, can we state the problem like this? Given an access request, what is the minimum of information that we need to ask a user to provide in order to let them in?
Absolutely. I love that statement. That's very well put together, right? The point is that all we really need to know from the user, what is the minimum attributes that we need in order to give them that service, right? And I love the way of thinking about that, because what it means is that it's tying the information we need from the user to actually what they want to do, rather than trying to think of it as a steel door and letting everybody through the door. It gives us context, right? And context is that rich data that we can use further on down the path, right? If all you want to do is browse documentation, well, I'm happy with your email address. But if you want to upload documentation, okay, hang on a minute. Now I want a little bit more from you because I need to validate some things. So I really like that problem definition. That was stated very, very nicely, and I think is a very nice model for us to live with.
Fantastic. Well, Alan, I think that what we'll do is we'll wrap it up there. That puts us exactly 10 minutes to the hour. And then just to close things off, first I want to thank Alan for your time. I really appreciate it. Obviously, you're bringing a wealth of knowledge and the information that you've gathered through a wonderful career in this industry. And we really appreciate you being able to take this time and share it with us. And then hopefully we'll catch you again at the next IdentityNORTH, which isn't too far away. Our next IdentityNORTH, which is the Western Workshop, is actually happening in Vancouver on January 22nd and 23rd of 2019. We're heading out west in winter because we know that some of us, as well as some of you, probably will take advantage of being there and hopefully join us in Whistler. We're looking at doing a very makeshift ski day for Identity on the Friday the 25th. Where we'll just be having a casual meet point for those who do want to participate in a ski day to get together. And then, as you mentioned earlier, then follow it up with some beers and some interesting conversation around questions of seamless access and multi-factor authentication. In addition to this, as I mentioned earlier, this is our second edition of the webinar series. We have another webinar that's coming up at the end of November that'll be featuring Interact. All of our webinars are recorded and will be available on the website shortly. You can do so by visiting our website at identitynorth.ca, and you can go underneath the webinar heading. In addition to that is that we also have all of our ticket sales, and then future webinars will be listed there as well. So on that note, I want to thank everyone for a wonderful afternoon, and we hope that you enjoyed the session. Alan, thank you again for your time. Any parting words or parting notes that you want to share?
Well, having been in Toronto for winter, I can assure you that the West Coast is a much more pleasant winter.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. Living in Toronto is a flat, miserable, wet wasteland. And I think what we want to do is be heading towards the mountains and the fresh powder if we can. Toronto is wonderful in June, not so much in January.
Absolutely. And thank you all very much.
Okay, thank you. Have a wonderful afternoon. We'll see you all soon. Bye now.